Hello again, my fine viewers. What are we going to talk about this time? We're going to talk about, well, last time we talked about labels. So I thought maybe we ought to talk about food labels. I talked about how food labels were a mix of generalized information and specific information. And then I mentioned that I implied that maybe food labels weren't as reliable as they present themselves to be. I don't think they are. So here we have a can of pumpkin. Just plain old cooked pumpkin. It's not pumpkin pie filling. It's just 100% pumpkin. And on the back, there is a food label. And it has all sorts of statistics on it. And what we want to know is, are these statistics at all helpful in us achieving our health goals? Now, there is one, because of the way the laws in the US work, there is one that's going to be helpful to you. And I don't know if you can see it, but all the way down here, I don't know if it's going to focus on it. Will it focus on it? No, it says ingredients, pumpkin, which means the only thing that's in this can is pumpkin. That is going to be helpful to you. The ingredient list will tell you if there's any chemicals or additives or seed oils or any of the things that you would like to avoid. That, right where it says ingredients, that's what's going to help you. That is by far the information on this label that's going to be the most useful. And the reason is because that is by far the most accurate information on this label. Okay? Excuse me. So let's look at the rest of the label. Nutrition facts right here. You know what I think? I think that what it actually should say is nutrition information as close to the facts as we feel like getting at a given moment. That's what it should say, right? Because most of this information here is simply not accurately recoverable. They're all based on generalizations and averages, all right? First of all, calories. This is calories right here. I talked briefly about calories before in a previous video, and basically this number is a generalization. And when you see this number, this means this is the amount of food energy that we're guessing most people under ordinary circumstances will probably physically absorb from a correctly sized portion of the food that is in this can. It is a very rough estimate. In fact, legally, although what use this law could possibly be, anyway, legally, this can be up to 20% off either way, and they're still allowed to label it. Now, seeing as when they test this stuff, they test it by burning it, that's completely inappropriate. But I explained to you in a previous video about calories, about how Wilbur Atwater did a whole bunch of experiments and then tabled all his data and thought he had come up with a way of converting heat calories to food energy calories. I don't think he got it particularly correct, but that's how it happened. Anyway, so even the most ardent food labeling advocates will have to admit that this is not accurate. It cannot be accurate. There's no way to presume how much food energy an individual is going to absorb at an individual circumstance from a particular portion of food. It just doesn't happen. It cannot be done. Okay, so keep that in mind. The calorie number is always wrong. It will always be wrong because there's no way to accurately do it, okay? Second of all, there's fats. Now, we're going to skip over the fats because this is pumpkin, and it's pretty well established that pumpkins don't have fat. So we're going to skip all this. We'll go on to something else in another video where we talk about the fat. But now we're going to go down here to, what's this one? Sodium. Sodium's pretty easy. You can, but still, it's an average because see down here, pumpkin, there's no salt added to this pumpkin. So the sodium has to be the sodium that's presumed to already be in the pumpkin. They can't test every can of food and tell you how much sodium is in this particular can of food. They make humongous batches of this in a food cannery, and then they can it all, and one in every, depending on their procedures, one in every 10, 20, 40, 50 batches or whatever, they test for sodium, and then they just give the average of these tests. So 5 milligrams of sodium, it's not much. For most people, sodium's not an issue anyway, but just be aware, this number cannot be accurate. It can be generalized, but it cannot be accurate for the food that is inside this particular can, okay? The next one is total carbohydrate. Okay, what's the deal with total carbohydrate? What does that mean, total carbohydrate? Well, carbohydrates come in basically two largely important forms, which is all we're going to be concerned about at the moment. Well, three. One of them is sugars, or mono or disaccharides, and that means two types of sugar molecules, two types of sugar, like for instance fructose and glucose, or lactose and glucose. Two types of sugar bound together. In sucrose, it's fructose and glucose bound together. And then there's fructose, glucose are the two off the top of my head, monosaccharides that I can think of. There are others, but those are the two most important ones for fructose, for sucrose. Anyway, and then there is starch, which is also digestible, and that is even longer chains of saccharides bound together, and those are considered better for you because your body has to break them up before it can use them. So it's considered helpful that they hang around in your gut just a tiny bit longer before they get absorbed. But the reality of it is, a lot of the starch that you eat is turning to sugar before it even leaves your mouth. So by the time it gets to your stomach, because of the amylase in your saliva, it just breaks those chains right apart. So a lot of that starch that's supposed to be better for you is actually already been turned to glucose before it even hits your stomach. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then the third type of carbohydrate that you commonly see is dietary fiber. Right? There are some people that would like to argue, and I sort of agree with them, that dietary fiber shouldn't even really be considered a dietary carbohydrate because your body simply can't do anything with it. We'll do another video on why some people think fiber is a necessary nutrient, which I don't agree with, by the way. But fiber is chains of saccharides that your body does not have the capacity to break down into the individual units and digest. So total carbohydrate combines starch, sugars, and fiber into the total amount of carbohydrate. Your body can only utilize the sugars and the starches. So a lot of people who are doing keto and they're counting up their carbohydrates, or even a lot of diabetics who are counting their carbohydrates, give themselves permission to exclude fiber in their carbohydrate count for various and sundry reasons. We don't need to go into that, but that's what total carbohydrate means, and that's what these down here mean. And again, keep in mind, these numbers, what does that say here? That's 10 grams total carbohydrate, 3 grams dietary fiber, which means if you're counting carbohydrates, you might count a serving of this pumpkin as only 7 grams of carbohydrate because there's 3 grams of dietary fiber. And you get to, under that paradigm, you get to take off that 3 grams and not count them. But then total sugar is 4 grams. And then whatever's left over, the 3 grams remaining is starches, right? Or more complex carbohydrate, or other kinds of complex carbohydrates. But as I said, these numbers are generalizations. They are generalizations that are done by testing specific amounts of not the food that's actually in this can, but foods that are similar. Okay? Foods that are other batches of pumpkin that are nothing but pumpkin get tested, and over time they average that out, and that's what they put on here. Okay, there could be more carbohydrate in a serving of this food than is shown on here. There could be 20% more. Okay, 20% of 10 grams of carbohydrate, right? That's a fifth. That means there could be as much as 12 grams of carbohydrate in here, and it would still not be considered inaccurate. There could be as little as 8 grams of carbohydrate in here, and it still wouldn't be considered inaccurate. All right? So when we're talking about 10 grams, that's not very much. 2 grams, that's not that much. But if you're talking like a candy bar or cookies, when you're talking about 30 or 40 grams of carbohydrate, okay, 20% of 40 is 8. So that's almost 10 additional carbohydrates that could be in, say, a candy bar. And the label still wouldn't be considered inaccurate. And if you're diabetic or if you're insulin dependent, you know that 10 grams of or 8 or 10 grams of carbohydrates is a significant difference. All right, so just keep that in mind. Now, all the way down here, we're going to talk about protein. Protein. It says 1 gram of protein. So obviously pumpkins don't have a whole lot of protein because they're fruits. The protein from a fruit is not bound up in its flesh, it's bound up in its seeds, okay? Again, that's a different video. What we need to know about protein is, protein, not only is this number an estimation, but it's not even an estimation of the actual protein that's found in the food. There's no way to measure, simply enough, amino acids that exist in a particular bolus of food. Okay? Excuse me. No way to measure that. So what do? They measure the nitrogen that's present in a sample of the food. Again, a generalized sample, not the food that's directly available in this can. Okay? They measure the nitrogen and they say, okay, protein is made up of this much nitrogen. So they measure all the nitrogen and they do a mathematical calculation and they say, well, if there's a amount of nitrogen in the food, then there must be B amount of protein in the food. Okay, sounds reasonable, right? The problem is that not all nitrogen found in a particular food, and it varies according to foods, not all nitrogen found in foods is actually bound up within a protein. So they could be measuring nitrogen that's not bound up within a protein and counting it as protein. Okay? So this 1 gram, there's probably not even a whole gram of protein. And then certainly there's not a whole gram of absorbable protein in this can of food. Now, there's a lot of people that will tell you that's okay. You don't need as much protein as you think you do anyway. Well, that's another argument that we'll have another day. But all of these numbers are inaccurate. All of them. No matter what food it is, no matter what the nutrition label is, no matter who publishes it, all of these numbers are inaccurate simply because of the fact that there's no way to chemically test the composition of a food and still put it in the can for you to buy. Can't be done. They can only take a representative sample, do that many times over time, and give you an aggregate number, an average, or a median, or a mean. That's all they can do. So, do you want to use this information as a generalized guide? I suppose that's good enough if you want to do that. But for me, the only thing I really pay attention to is this right here, ingredients. That will tell me, is this something I want to eat, or is this something I'd prefer not to eat? And if it's just a food that I'd prefer not to eat, like pumpkin, I have to admit, this is my can of pumpkin. And I do have a can of pumpkin because once a year I make a pumpkin pie, and I make it as low carb as I'm physically able to do. But it's still not carnivore food, if you want to go by that label. And it's still not particularly beneficial for me, but I decide to do it once a year for Thanksgiving. And you can do that too if you want to, as long as you know what you're doing. That's what I'm trying to get across here in all my videos. It doesn't matter so much what the label is, or what other people call it, or what it's been identified as. What is important is that you understand what you're doing. You understand the choices that you make. If you understand your own thinking process, and you understand the logic, and you understand the facts behind it, and you understand the research and the science, then you can label it whatever you want. But you'll know what you're doing, regardless of what label you put on it. Okay? So, this is a label. It's meant to provide specific information. It doesn't, because it can't. Okay, and that's true with every other food label in existence. It's simply not possible. So it's a generalized guideline. And if you find that useful, you do you, but I don't. So eventually I'll eat this pumpkin as a celebration. But most of the time, nah. So that's all for right now. Peace, love, and meat. I love you. You know what to do with those. The little arrow, share, sub, bell, ding dong. You know what to do. I love you all. See you next time.